job as a journalist. And never seen him challenged for that. He can talk about anything and make it interesting. Second is learned that even in a business, like most businesses where writing is not valued the way it once was, being a talented writer is an advantage. And I think about it all the time. The quality of writing in television for the course of my career has steadily declined to the point now where it isn't even thought about. People get hired to be network correspondents and anchors. They can't write a lick. Brit is a great writer and a great writer for broadcast. And I learned how important that is. I'm not in his league, but I did learn from him how important it is. And finally, and this one's maybe sounds a little trivial, but it always sticks in my mind. When you're doing a sign off as a correspondent, you say, Joe Smith, ABC News, the Pentagon. Brit had the ability in the pause between where he was and saying his name to calibrate how long that should be and what facial expression he should have to convey more than most correspondents could convey in a 4-minute piece. So you go, Brit Hume, ABC News, the White House. And the pause, I put a stopwatch on it. It's different every time, and I learned how to do that. And again, not in Brit's league. I said, Mark Halperin, Des Moines, Iowa. Mark Halperin, ABC News, Des Moines, Iowa. Magic, television magic. All right, joining us now, Alexander Brit Hume, again, someone I'm grateful to and would not have the career I have without him. Brit, thank you for joining.
My great pleasure, Mark. It's wonderful to see you.
Really great to have you here. I talked in my monologue about media bias, and it's one of the many things I learned from you when we worked together at ABC News covering a new Democratic president. And you covered them tough the way you covered the Bush administration. But we were surrounded by people who were in rapture. First Democratic president since Carter. I'm wondering how you see the arc of liberal media bias from Clinton to Trump, and that's obviously a PhD thesis topic, but is it worse now than it was back when Clinton was president? Has it gotten worse? And what accounts for the degree to which, even in the age of transparency, most of our major news organizations can be so biased?
Well, I think it's gotten worse, Mark, I'm sorry to say. And part of it is I think that people get into journalism for different reasons. And when I was coming along, people got into journalism. In my case, it was because I couldn't find any other job at the time. But I think a lot of reporters thought it was interesting. In those days, the custom of neutral news coverage was deeply ingrained, and that's how you were taught to cover the news. And if you let any bias or opinion slip into your copy, it would be X'd out, and you'd be criticized for it by the city editor or by your editor, whoever it was. And I think that tradition has faded. And I also think that the arrival on the national scene of Donald Trump has accelerated the process, because if you were trying to design somebody that journalists would not like, you could hardly do better than Donald Trump. You know, rich, crude in some ways, vulgar, full of braggadocio, not really a liberal, except in some ways before he really got into politics. So I think he was, a person designed to be disliked. And journalists were attracted to the idea that the man constituted a danger to the American system. And they treated his election in 2016 as a national emergency and felt it was their job to put out the fire, which is to say was to try to bring him down, which they most certainly tried to do, and in my view, made fools of themselves in the process.
And helped Trump, right?
Well, in the end, it did, because it was so bad and so obvious, not just what journalists did, but what Democratic Party prosecutors did, what the intelligence community to some extent did. All those things, I think, were clear to the public. And I think because of that, they ended up helping him in the end.
There's a story today that NBCnews.com ran, and it says Chairman Comer, who's leading the investigation into Joe Biden's use of the auto pen for pardons and other things, that Chairman Comer often signs letters as part of the investigation using an auto pen. It couldn't be more different, right? It's not about pardons and the question of who's signing them, and he's not signing subpoenas with the auto pen. He's just signing letters. No serious person could think that was a news story, and yet NBC wrote it up as if it was a gotcha hypocrisy thing. So here's the question. Here's the question I'd ask you, which I engaged on Twitter with folks today. Do people at NBC know that is a phony story, but they write it on purpose? Are they so diluted that they think it's a real story?
Well, I'm afraid I think it's the latter, Mark. I mean, as young journalists come along and they hear a story about auto pen being used by Mr. Biden, and therefore, anybody using the auto pen becomes a kind of an equivalent in their mind and imagination. And the next thing you know, you got stories written about it when it's perfectly clear, or should be, that nobody is talking about Mr. Biden's use of the auto pen for letters and other routine things. The concern, to the extent there is a concern, is about using the auto pen for very serious official documents, such as pardons and the like.
Where he may not have been the signer.
Right.
The decider.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the concern. My own view is that the pardon power, which is what's most often talked about, is so plenary, so nearly absolute, that if he chose to do it by, saying certain categories of people should be pardoned, and the staff then whipped up a group that fit the criteria, and the auto pen was used to do it, that probably passes muster in the courts.
You've been smart enough largely to stay out of management, but let's say you were the Washington bureau chief of NBC News, and Comer's comms director called you and said, Brit, this story you guys have on the website's ridiculous. And you looked at it and you said, yeah, it's ridiculous. What would you do then?
Well, I'd take it down, and I would call the journalists who are involved in it sit them down, and ask them questions about how it is that they reasoned out the idea that this was a news story. And if the reasoning was as faulty as it seems to be, they would be reprimanded, and it would be a mark against them.
Okay, and then what if the head of Comcast called you and said, Brit, great job, you're absolutely right. We need to routinize this from not happening. We need to fix it. I don't want NBC News to be a liberally biased place. What would you do then? What would be the structural reforms you could possibly make, if any, or is it impossible to fix it?
Well, I think it's deeply ingrained, but I know this. At Fox News, I was managing editor in Washington, and we were able to find people to hire journalists and tell them what our method was for covering news. I'm not talking about the evening opinion shows or any of the rest of it. I'm simply talking about our news coverage, the production of packages and other news reports that we were looking for. And I talked about the kinds of stories we were looking for, and I talked about about neutrality in news coverage. And it used to be so customary, Mark, as I'm sure you know, that it wasn't hard to teach back in the day, and it shouldn't be hard to teach now. I just simply think it's not taught.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the vice president. There's so many aspects of this administration that I find to be unprecedented, at least in my career in modern times. I've never seen a vice president accumulate so much power so quickly in politics and policy and personnel. I'm wondering if you think about maybe Dick Cheney as the standard of a powerful vice president. Where do you rate J.D. Vance in terms of accumulation of power at this early stage?
Well, he'd be right up there. Dick Cheney was quite powerful, and because the president wanted him to be and leaned on him, President Bush, 43, leaned on him for advice and counsel, and he was heavily influential in the field of national security policy, foreign affairs, and so on. Vance seems to have an even broader writ, and I think Trump likes him because he's a really good spokesman. He's a very bright guy, a very talented guy, speaks well, and I remember thinking at a time during the campaign, Mark, when there was a lot of talk about maybe Trump was gonna dump him, and I would see these interviews on the Sunday shows when Vance was out, and he was out a lot, where he would simply run rings around his hosts and make them look ridiculous. And I thought Trump is going to like that, and like that a lot. And he did, and he continues to, and that accounts, in my judgment, his effectiveness as a spokesman accounts for his accumulation of influence, and I think it's considerable.